Welcome back. In this video, we are going to be learning one of the most basic stitches that you will use in sewing. It's called a running stitch. Now, a running stitch is a pretty classic, pretty basic stitch that it's basically just running your needle through your fabric over and over to make a little dotted line. You use it a lot when you are doing a temporary seam, if you need to gather just a little bit of fabric pretty quickly, or you can use it as a decorative stitch just to give it that cute little dotted line on a project that you're working on. So you can see here in front of me, I've got my fabric laid out and ready to go. I've got my needle, I've got my thread, and then up here I've got my embroidery scissors. These are a little smaller than you would use to cut fabric, but they're great for thread, that I'm just gonna set to the side. We'll come back to them when I have ends that I need to trim. So as I get going, I'm going to very quickly tie my sewing knot that we've already talked about that. Get my X, roll it off the tip of my finger, flip it over so I've got my triangle, pull it tight. Okay, and there we go. I've got a nice snug knot there. Now I'm going to grab my needle, fold my thread over the top of my needle, pinch it super, super tight to the top there. And then with that little loop, I'm just going to feed it through the eye of my needle and pull it through. Okay, and now I am ready to sew. Where one thing I do want to address really quickly, you can actually pull through both ends and then tie your knot at this point with both ends together. Same process as you've been using, and that's really nice sometimes because then you will not lose your needle. However, I personally do not like to do that because if I have to go back and unpick stitches, it's a lot easier to do that if I can just pull my thread off the needle entirely and then just pull the thread out going back through my stitches. So if you choose to only have a knot at one end of your only use one end of your thread in your knot, the way to prevent your thread from slipping out is you just make sure that you're grabbing your needle right at the eye, or better yet, hold it like that with your tail coming through your hand so that you can kind of grab onto it the whole way down through there and it won't come out. Now, for our running stitch, we are now ready to get going. So we've got our fabric. Now the thing with the running stitch that is the most tricky is that you want it to be an even stitch length the whole way through. Where if you do a bunch of random stitch lengths, it's gonna look sloppy. So there are a few tricks you can use. The one I'm going to be showing you today is something that it's great as you are just getting started. Okay, so a good base length for a running stitch is to start at about 1/4 inch. Now that's not going to be small enough to hold together fabric for any long period of time. That is something that you're using it strictly for decoration or for a temporary stitch. But if you make it about 1/4 inch, you can actually double check that. It's about the width across your pinky nail. Okay, and I can see right there that I've got the width of my pinky nail. Nice and easy. So I am going to pull my thread through, and you can see I have my nice firm knot that caught right there. All right, now here's the thing as you are starting to sew, that you actually want to make sure you're giving it just a little bit of extra strength. So I'm going to go through the exact same spots. So I'm going to go right underneath my knot, and I'm going to come out right there where my thread is already coming through from that first stitch. All right, and sometimes pinching down right on top of your stitch, so long as you're not pinching too hard, can actually help it to slide through just a little easier without tangling. Okay, but you can see this is actually going to be the back side of my fabric now because that's where my knot is. I've got one stitch, okay? And if I flip it over to what's going to become my front, I have one stitch as well. That if I want to double check it, it is about a pinky width across. So I'm doing good. I've got, for my first stitch, the right length. Now, what I'm gonna do is go back to the back side, okay, and I'm gonna go about 1/4 of an inch away. Now, before I start pulling my thread through, I want to double check, is that the right length? So I'm gonna take my pinky nail again, and I'm gonna check. There's the end of one stitch. That's where my needle is going down through. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull my thread through. Okay, and so you can see there that actually, it's going to look just a little different on the back versus the front, because right now I have one solid line with a little bump right there for where my stitch connects. Now on the front side, here's that dotted line effect I was talking about, that there's my first stitch, and now there is a space. Okay, so I'm actually going to use my stitches as a way to kind of gauge how straight my line is. That I'm going to put my needle right there, and you can see my needle is making a straight line. I'm also going to get my pinky in there, double check that where the thread is coming out, where the needle is going through. There we go. We've got about 1/4 inch. All right, and so I am good to pull it through. So you can see on the front side, I've started making a dotted line, and on the back side, it's now going to look more like a dotted line the whole way through. Okay, so I am ready to do my next piece on the back, you can see. And I'm going to do the same thing. Use my needle to kind of judge, is my line straight? Poke my needle through, and before I start sewing, I'm actually going to check, is it the right length? And I think it's actually a little longer than I want it to be. So before I pull my thread through, I'm going to take my needle out, poke it through my fabric again, and this time around, there we go. There's the end of one stitch. That's where my needle's going through. And so now I know that I've got my 1/4 inch ready to go. So I pull it through without pulling it so tight that it starts to pucker my fabric. Turn it over to the back side, and you can see I'm ready to keep going with my dotted line. Now, one other thing I want to show you guys is if you start feeling pretty comfy with that, what you can also start to do is to speed up the process just a little bit, and I'm still going to be double checking. But rather than continually flipping back and forth, I can now start putting my needle through the fabric before I pull it through, and I can double check right there that that little bit is about 1/4 inch. And I'm going to go down another 1/4 inch away, double check that. It's about the length of a pinky nail. And we can even go there. That looks just a little long already, so I'm going to pull it back through. Okay, and double check before I pull it that it's in a straight line with the stitches I already have. There's my 1/4 inch. And gently pull it through. And you guys can see that right there, I actually got a bunch of my dotted line in there. Okay, so I would say get really comfy with flipping it back and forth before you do that, but once you are comfy with flipping it back and forth, you are more than welcome to begin to do that. Okay, now I'm going to actually do one more, and then I'm going to flip it over so that I can show you guys very quickly here how to tie it off. Okay, so you can see I'm on the back side, and I know that because my knot is right here. Okay, we've already designated that this is going to be the back side. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to back up my needle to where my last stitch started. And this is going to be very similar to how we started our sewing. I'm going to put it through, both of the holes that we made for that last stitch, match it up as nicely as I can. And on the back side, just like at the start of my sewing, that is going to make it so that instead of having a dotted line, I have a solid line for 2 stitches. And that's okay, because on the front side, it's still a nice dotted line, okay? So you need to do that at least twice. I'm actually gonna go through one more time so that there's a total of 3 stitches right there. Pull it nice and snug. And the way to then tie that off, because if you just trim that, you haven't made a knot, so it can still come undone. So what you are going to do to then fix that in place is I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to put it through right at the top of that loop where I just came out, and I'm going to go underneath the thread that's already there so that I'm not actually going through my fabric. I'm using the thread to help me tie a knot. Now if you catch a thread or two from your fabric, that's not the end of the world, but I do want to show you. You can't actually see any of the metal of my needle on the front side. Okay, we're doing that so that we can hide the knot. And I'm going to take my needle underneath those 2 or 3 threads, and I'm just going to wrap the thread around my needle so you can see it's making a little loop there, and pull it through. And when I do that, you can actually see that there's a little knot that I just made, that it's completely invisible from the front, but on the back side, you can now see it really well. So I'm going to do that 2 or 3 times. And I actually, at this point, am just going straight back through that knot I already made. And pull it snug the whole way through. Okay, and now when I lay it out, you can see I've got my stitches that they're not going to go anywhere. I'm going to grab my scissors, trim that off just a little ways away from the knot. Not directly on the knot though, we don't want to cut that off. And there we go. There is my running stitch, front and back.